Well, hello everybody. Thank you for joining me again. Today I'm dealing with a very interesting topic. I've coined it, as some other people have coined it as well, the social turn, the shift in the way we look at literacy, particularly emanating from a socio-cognitive, political, and also anthropological and sociological lens. As I describe what sort of occurs in the social turn, I've been trying to think of what the metaphor is for how this transformed our thinking in terms of literacy. And as I thought about it, I had a couple of different metaphors, so I apologize for mixing up the metaphors. One was sort of equivalent to watching a tennis match and discovering what's going on the court isn't really what's important. What's more important is sort of watching the coaches. And in one sense, I think the social turn is a little bit like taking a step back and realizing that what we sometimes viewed as the context was where a lot of the action was occurring. Or another metaphor I thought about was in golf, that oftentimes people focus on the mechanics of a golf swing. But if you look at the research on, if you really want to improve your golf, you should focus on the trajectory, where the ball is going. And in one sense, those sort of metaphors try to capture for me what actually sort of happened. Because historically, we looked at socio-cultural elements in conjunction in terms of looking at reading. If you go back and look at some of the anthropologist studies of literacy, you start to see how literacy has been historically framed in terms of social negotiations between people. Indeed, what anthropologists sort of, I think, have deemed as the earliest precursors of writing was identified in a study that Schmatt-Bezerat did in Samaria, where she examined a number of remnants from anthropological digs and found a number of different sort of tokens, not only tokens, but these sort of clay things that look like envelopes. And as she looked across these digs, set in about the 4th millennium BC, she realized that what she was dealing with were these tokens, and began to recognize, in conjunction with some of the other things she was looking at, that these tokens were actually probably the earliest precursors of print. They were symbols or tokens used to signify different objects that was used in trade. And so with these tokens, people could actually, without really going out in their field and counting their livestock or their goods, they could negotiate in trade with one another. And indeed, the clay envelopes that she discovered were sort of almost, as she sort of considered them, almost like artifacts which represented an envelope equivalent to where one would place the tokens as almost like a form of contract. Schmatt-Bezerat and most anthropologists sort of recognized, well, these were the earliest precursors of print. In some respects, I think actually you can go and look at art and also see things which were, I think, precursors of writing. Michael Taylor's work in Australia with the Australian Indigenous population, Australian Aborigines in the Northern Territory area around Arnhem Land, was very interesting relative to looking at the extent to which art was used in a way to enculturate generations. And it defined through their art, their geography, things within their boundaries in a sense, using repetition and images to teach and also relay to people what's sort of distinctive of that cultural or peoples. And that being used for thousands upon thousands of years as a part of sort of the teaching about and with culture in a cultural sort of sense. What was interesting as anthropologists sort of looked at this, writing assumed an amazing place as it did evolve, and over history. And people started to argue that writing actually afforded those cultures that engaged in writing, those cultures they deemed literate, interestingly, because they used writing to exchange and communicate, sometimes to write histories, that these people were advantaged in terms of intellectually, in terms of their reasoning ability. Jack Goody, in some of his writings, wrote extensively about what writing afforded people in terms of their ability to do socially in relationship to their to others, in relationship to their role in society. However, some people question that and sort of said, well, this is almost research. This is a researchable area. And a very interesting study in an amazing location was conducted by Sylvia Scribner and Michael Cole, which they talk about in this book, The Psychology of Literacy. In there, they examined the Great Divide hypothesis among the VI people, where they could find people who were literate and non-literate, people who used writing and people who didn't use writing, people who were educated and also non-educated, had been schooled or not. And we're interested to see if, in fact, differences would show up on what they consider to be reasoning tests, tests which involve sorting of objects, tests involved logical reasoning, and other tests that they thought might be associated with this advantage that people were claiming that signified this great divide. What was interesting about their findings were that in reality they could find advantages tied to the writing and how the writing was used in situations, but they couldn't find those distinct advantages that people were advocating relative to the Great Divide. Now, that may seem to be not as significant as I think it is, because oftentimes in history we've actually used literacy to sort of separate people who were considered worthy to participate in voting, for example, from people who might not be worthy of it. For example, historically, sometimes people were denied the vote because they couldn't read and write. And with economic advantage or inherited advantage, often privilege carried with it the right to be literate and or to learn to be literate, and with that, in a sense, the privilege of power, and oftentimes being part of the ruling class. So, sort of dealing with that Great Divide hypothesis is I think, a very significant development, which, as we will see as we look at some of the socio-cultural political developments, raises its in a sense, what I consider its ugly head across time, including into the 20th century, and I believe also into the 21st century. So writing per se has been a subject of anthropological studies, but it also has been a study of the sociology of knowledge, and particularly philology, the study of the sociology of language and philosophy and how it changes across time. Indeed, one of my favorite books is like a life work by Randall Collins, A Global Theory of Intellectual Change, where he studies the sociology of philosophers, looking at their long lineages in terms of how knowledge has shifted and changed in the hands of different people, in the hands of different groups. And with that knowledge has come different advantages, certain shifts in the society, and so on, which he describes both in his narratives and with these sort of sketches. And so you'll find a number of discussions of the sociology of knowledge over time, dating back thousands of years in terms of how it's developed. Indeed, one of the discussions that I find quite interesting is the study of the sociology of knowledge for the Ming Dynasty, where the Ming Dynasty was so focused on judging the authenticity of text, sort of looking at text in a very structural, fixed author meaning orientation, and the extent to which that shaped that society, and indeed made it somewhat vulnerable to the Manchus who eventually conquered them. Again, that sort of sociology of knowledge mixes literacy in with the society to begin to sort of understand the dynamics of that society, the power that literacy has in that society, and how, to a large extent, defines who that society is, the nature of their discoveries, and the nature of their daily activity. So when I think about the social turn, I think about it being deep-rooted in our histories of consideration of literacies. What I'll move to next is the recent history of the socio-cognitive political aspects of literacy, which eventually lead to the social turn.